very similar. There are many, many disconcerting parallels. The only one of the big differences is that when you analyze how World War I was orchestrated, because it was contrived deliberately, you go away with the impression that people who were doing this in London primarily, but also in Paris and in St. Petersburg, that they were extremely clever, that they have done, genius level planning and scheming and these intrigues that all kind of brought the whole system closer and closer and closer to an irreversible outbreak of war. We see attempts to do the same here, only it's not clever. They seem to be making it up as they go along, because plan A failed long ago. The plan A was, we provoke Russia into a quagmire of Ukraine. The combined West unites. We all together go to war against Russia. We hit them with nuclear sanctions, largest package of sanctions.
This comparison is frightening because it shows how different things are today. Back then, World War I was driven by cold, calculated planning. Dangerous, yes, but deliberate. Now, it feels like our leaders are just making it up as they go. Plan A failed, the strategy collapsed, and instead of resetting, they're improvising with global stakes on the line. Wars don't only start from genius, sometimes they start from incompetence, and that's what makes this moment even more dangerous.
Basically break the back of Russia, Vladimir Putin falls, and we take over. We install, Alexei Navalny or, some new version of Boris Yeltsin, and then Russia is ours. And then, we run the whole preparation to go against China and Iran. That plan failed almost immediately. And so what we have now is grasping at straws. And they're looking desperately into escalating the war to try to put together a united front of NATO, combined West against Russia. And they're looking for any pretext, any excuse. Oh, Russian vessels in international waters is pointing lasers at our planes. Well, obviously we have to go to war. Obviously you're going to have to sacrifice your children. Obviously we have to again go through a complete and total destruction of the whole European continent with tens of millions of victims. We can't have Russians pointing lasers at our plane. That's an outrage that we shall never be able to put up with. And so it's very dumb. It's not persuading anybody. And I think that parents of young men and young men across Europe are not convinced. There has to be strong psychological preparation for war. People have to feel that if they're going to fight and die, if parents are going to risk sacrificing their children, there has to be for a just cause.
This is the part that exposes how disconnected the whole strategy has become. The original plan to collapse Russia, replace Putin, and control the region failed instantly, and now the West is scrambling for any excuse to escalate, even something as trivial as a laser incident. But people aren't buying it anymore. Parents won't send their sons into a war built on flimsy narratives. If you want a nation to fight, there has to be a real cause, not political desperation. This push for escalation feels forced, shallow, and out of touch with what the public is willing to sacrifice for.
Vladimir Zelensky is up to his eyeball in a very ugly corruption scandal right now. He's losing public support at home. Well, he pretty much lost public support at home. His military is falling apart as we speak. The desertions are at multiples the level of last year and the year before that. Soldiers are surrendering in droves because they don't want to fight for a corrupt fascist regime that is primarily focused on war profiteering, while they are asked to be manning the trenches in the mud and dying for they don't even know what cause. And so, as the Western powers, and I'm talking primarily about London, Paris, and Berlin, are watching their pet projects go down in flames, they are now desperately trying to find a way to keep it going, even at a cost of sacrificing their own population. The British young men, French young men, German young men, Polish young men, whoever they can somehow maneuver into perpetuating the fight. And it's pathetic and it's ridiculous, but we must not underestimate them, because throughout history, a small handful of men were able to define the destinies of entire peoples and countries and continents.
This is the part where the narrative completely cracks. Zelensky is losing support, the army is collapsing, and soldiers are surrendering because they don't even know what they're dying for. And instead of admitting failure, Western capitals are trying to keep the war alive by pushing their own young men into it. It looks desperate, it looks reckless, and history shows that when weak leaders panic, small groups can still drag entire nations into disaster.
Trump administration, for all the chaotic insanity of their rhetoric, of their head fakes, and then distractions, misdirections, and everything that we see coming out of there, the evidence I see strongly suggests that they're earnestly working for peace. And there's a lot of reasons to dispute this if we're talking about Ukraine, if we're talking about Israel and Iran, if we're talking about Yemen, Venezuela, places like this, because Trump almost deliberately creates almost like a casus belli, like robust preparation for war at the same time as he's negotiating with his counterparts. And then later you realize, it doesn't seem that he ever had the intention of going to war. But there is one place that is not on anybody's radar, that's not a household name, that Trump gets zero credit for, and that is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is there in the heart of the Balkans. This is where, the capital is Sarajevo. People will remember 1914 Sarajevo. This is where World War I was detonated over 110 years ago. And this is where the British have been agitating for war for years now. And this was obvious to everybody locally. Local people were openly talking about, it's the British. They're pushing us into war. They're provoking all these escalations. The British themselves, their think tanks like RUSI, Royal United Services Institution, were openly writing about the Balkans being the second front in West's war against Russia. And why? Because the Balkans are a powder keg. You have a lot of different peoples there, and the Bosnia and Herzegovina itself is like an amalgamation of Croats who are Catholic, Bosniaks who are Muslim, and Serbians who are Serbian Orthodox Christians. And so it's relatively easy to pit these three people against one another by staging provocations. And this was being done. And we watched for the last 2 or 3 years, provocations just escalate. Muslims against Croats, Croats against Muslims, Croats against Serbs, Muslims against... So this was just kind of, the tensions were rising. And it seemed that descent into war was almost inevitable. And that all changed practically from the day Donald Trump walked into the White House. And I've been, getting those news from people, just kind of hearsay, people's impressions.
What's surprising here is that while Trump sounded chaotic, in the Balkans the opposite happened. Bosnia was close to exploding, tensions rising everywhere, but once Trump took office, that escalation suddenly cooled. Sometimes the loud talk hides quiet diplomacy, and in this case, it may have prevented a real war.
Ministers in the Serbian government in Bosnia, and I asked him point blank, face to face, one on first person testimony. And I asked him, have things changed since Trump came to power? And he shot straight at me. Oh yes, dramatically. He said the situation is day and night. Everything is better. And he even mentioned something about a lithium concession. They were negotiating it with the British, and he said the British were very hardline, very aggressive, and unyielding in their demands. And he said, now we're dealing with the Americans, and they're much more reasonable, much more accommodating. What does this tell us, Nima? It tells us that, first of all, the Trump administration had to be aware of they had to have been aware of the problem. They had to have understood what the objectives of the British are. And they had to have come in there and said, you guys are out of here, we're taking over, and there's not going to be war. Because remember, in August of this year, right after the Alaska summit, Kirill Dmitriev, who is very close with Putin, tweeted a very affirmative statement that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump will prevent World War III from breaking out. And he didn't say should prevent it, might prevent it, could. He said will.
This testimony is revealing. A Serbian minister flat out said the moment Trump arrived, the atmosphere shifted from aggressive and dangerous to calm and workable. Even the negotiations changed. The British were pushing hard, while the Americans came in with a far more reasonable approach. That tells us something important. Trump's team understood the risks, moved the British aside, and quietly shut down the path to another Balkan war. And when people close to Putin publicly say Trump will prevent a major conflict, not might, it shows how seriously they believed that shift was.
From Russia saying, we're optimistic about this because it's not just about Ukraine. We're working on a whole new security architecture from Europe, which means that the 2 centuries of British geopolitics of, what they call balance of power, of, basically divide and rule, pitting force against force. And as soon as one emerges stronger than the other, then they, kind of orchestrate a war to mow the lawn, I guess, on the continent. We might see an end to this, and we might see a future of peace. Again, I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but this is not random. The diffusing tensions in Bosnia was done deliberately and with knowledge of the situation. And it wasn't done for political points because, if we're talking about Israel, it's harder to analyze because there's a strong Israeli lobby in the United States. There's Christian evangelicals. So everything is very political. Whatever you do, you're appeasing some constituency at home. The situation in Ukraine is also very delicate because it involves all the American traditional allies. So everything they do has to, again, either misdirect or appease or deceive some party in the equation. In Bosnia, not the case. Nobody cares. Nobody sees it. It's on nobody's radar. Nobody's talking about Bosnia. And the Trump administration doesn't have any audience that they have to appease. They just went there and made peace, or let's say diffused it for the time being, the war tensions, because it was the right thing to do. And I think that's very significant. They deserve credit for it. And it tells me that they understand the nature of the problem and that they are putting in the good work to prevent war from breaking out. Again, total war on the European continent would probably be worse than World War I and World War II combined.
This is important because it shows something we almost never hear: Russia saying they're actually optimistic about building a new security architecture with the West. That means ending 2 centuries of divide and rule politics in Europe. And the Bosnia example proves it. The de-escalation wasn't an accident. It wasn't political theater, there were no votes to win, no lobby to satisfy. It was simply done because preventing another Balkan war was the right move. That tells us Trump's team understood the risks, understood the British game, and acted early to stop a conflict most of the world wasn't even watching. And if they hadn't, a full-scale European war could be far worse than anything the last century saw.
Is the question of Venezuela and the question of Bagram Air Base. Because that was the first time I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe Trump is control opposition. But we haven't heard anything about Bagram Air Base anymore. He just made a few statements after his meeting with King Charles and in England when he was in London, and then nothing. And then with Venezuela, I still don't know what's going to happen there. But I remember the hostilities with Iran, when they were for weeks they were bringing these B-2 bombers and troops to Diego Garcia and all these assets, making it look like they're completely preparing for a major regime change war against Iran. And then nothing. We had a fake war. Some people say like, oh, no, it was not fake war. He went to war against Iran. No, he didn't. A war is Libya. A war is Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. Those are real wars. Remember Fallujah, how it was in Syria, how it was in Libya. It was like weeks upon weeks of hundreds of sorties, thousands of tons of bombs dropped. This was just one day, couple of things. This was a fake war. So I still hope that the Venezuelan situation will work itself out in a similar way, because we've now just found out a few days ago that as all this escalation and rhetoric was going on, they opened negotiations with the Maduro regime. And then I haven't heard from Machado in a few days. I don't know what happened to her, but she's kind of gone off the media radars. So we'll see. But in general, particularly judging by the statements coming out of Russia, it seems to me that something is happening for real, that the system in the world is being changed, and that it's going from permanent forever wars into something different in a new security architecture, which is hopefully one that will give us a permanent peace.
This part shows how chaotic U.S. foreign policy has become. One week it's Venezuela, the next it's Iran, then suddenly everything disappears like it never happened. These fake wars, loud threats, flashy deployments, and then silence reveal one thing: the old playbook of endless intervention is losing steam. What's changing now is deeper. Global powers are shifting away from permanent conflict and toward new security structures that don't rely on nonstop war. And whether Washington likes it or not, the world is slowly moving in that direction, towards stability built on negotiation, not destruction.